Hey everyone, it's Peter Cole and I'm back with my Intro to Sample Library series, and this particular part of the series we're focused on percussion. So if you've seen some of my other videos, or if you haven't, please check them out and I'll link to them in the description of this video. But I've been doing a number of videos for beginners, so if you're just kind of getting started with making music in your digital audio workstation, working with MIDI, in particular working with sample libraries, this is a series for you. Now, like I said, it's a little bit more focused in orchestral world, actually quite a bit more focused in orchestral world, but a lot of the concepts apply to any style of music. And again, this series in particular is about the percussion instruments, so more percussion-based conversations we're having now. Now, the first video in this percussion series was just kind of getting an understanding of the family of percussion instruments, so I encourage you to check that out if this is new to you. We also talked about the different frequency ranges that those instruments fall into, which is a really important concept for writing for percussion. Then in the last video, I kind of went back to the very basics and we really talked about, how do you count rhythms, what's a beat, what's a measure, what's a time signature, tempo, these kind of fundamental concepts that are applying directly to what we're about to get into now, which is quantization inside of our DAW. So what is quantization? If you're new to this idea of quantization, well, it's this idea of you performing your piece. In this case, it's a percussion piece we're talking about, but it could be any type of any instrument at all. Believe me, anything. But it's this idea of performing it, and it's getting recorded by the software, and it could be audio. We're not talking about audio files now. We're talking about MIDI recordings. So MIDI digital recordings. And sometimes those performances aren't quite perfect, right? They don't quite line up, on the beat. So they might be a little off the beat here and there. They might be a little head of the beat sometimes, a little behind the beat. Bottom line is, quantization is a process using the software that's inside of your digital audio workstation. It's a process to allow us to kind of put all those notes back onto the beat, so everything kind of sounds back in time again. And it's kind of multifaceted here, right? Because there's the concept of the beat that's going on in the piece itself, but then there's all the other instruments playing together. It's this combination of getting everything kind of working together, and it's finding a nice balance. And on the topic of balance, quite possibly the biggest challenge of all this is if we over quantize, if we make everything totally perfect and everything's lining up on the beat and everything looks beautiful in the DAW and it's exactly what the quantization feature is kind of intended to do. The problem is, now what? Now we have music that's too perfect and it might sound robotic, mechanical, and that isn't good either. So this is an art form, right? We're using these tools. There's not really any one way to tell you to do it. You have to understand the tools and then play with them and get familiar with them and practice with them until you're able to kind of understand the best ways to use them. And that might be the biggest lesson of the whole video right there. It's practice and just getting familiar. So that's what we're starting right now, just starting to practice and learn what the tools are. So I'm going to jump inside my DAW now, and I'm using Logic, but of course you can use any digital audio workstation that allows you to edit MIDI, because again, we're just talking about MIDI for now. Audio quantization will be a whole separate video down the road, but MIDI, and that is recording a performance from your MIDI interface. In my case, I'm using a MIDI keyboard by Native Instruments. A very nice keyboard, but of course this keyboard is not a drum. Big difference. When I'm entering a performance into my keyboard, I'm not hitting it with drumsticks, I'm hitting it with my fingers. So it's a very different medium for trying to recreate a drum performance. And that's the challenge here. So I've recorded this performance, I've put it into my digital audio workstation. It's been recorded, and let's just hear how it sounds like. I've already done this. There's a couple things I'm going to do. I'm going to play the piece. I'm going to open up the MIDI editor so you can actually see the files. There's two different sections we're dealing with. I ended up eventually, as I worked on this piece, adding more layers to the music, but for today's video, we're just focused on the low drum, which is essentially like a bass drum. And you can see how like basic this is. It's literally just one kind of line. And then the other thing I added on top of it, kind of the lead instrument, were these woods. So I used some wood instruments. So let's just play. I'm gonna solo them each individually so you can really hear the difference, what's going on. But just to get an idea of what it sounds like currently before any editing has been done. So you can probably tell, I mean, it's decent, but you can already, I'm sure you can hear that there's a lot of stuff off. And even a better way to tell is to zoom in on our MIDI here. And this is really what the whole lesson is about today. You can see all these lines, which if you didn't see my other video, I talked about this idea of the grid. That's what this is, the grid. And each one of these lines represents kind of a note on the grid. You can think of it that way, right? So if you have this grid and you're trying to fit a bunch of notes within there, so you can put a whole note, you can put a half note, you can put a 16th note, 8th note, all these different, and they're all lining up ideally in their appropriate position within the grid. And again, if this is completely new to you, please watch the previous video. I go into a little more detail there about that, but it's pretty self-explanatory, right? You can see already, you know, I was pretty far off here. However, I mean, just listen back to it again one more time. If you listen to just the woods by themselves, so I'm going to mute the low drum, the bass drum. It's amazing how it's definitely off. Definitely, don't get me wrong, but there's aspects of it that are kind of cool. And this is what I'm talking about, because it's a little loose, right? It's a little bit loose. You kind of want that looseness. But it's not in beat with the overall click of the song itself, right? The tempo. If you're not familiar with the click track, look up here at the top. This is where Logic keeps it. This is how you set your metronome settings, and that's what defines the click. So right now, let me just turn that up so you can hear it a little more. Listen to the click. Here's the click by itself. So there we go. There's our tempo. And when I initially recorded this, I played this in the background and I played the drums on top, and you can see I was pretty off. However, it still captured a performance, and it captured a natural performance, and it doesn't sound terrible. But then when I throw the bass drum in, the bass drum is also off. So now you have kind of three things that are off, and this is the problem. And this is why quantization is so important. It's not just about making an individual performance perfect. No, we're not trying to do that, because we want some of that natural human flavor that comes into a performance. We want that. But we need to start getting our notes a little closer to the beat so that they are closer together as kind of a unit, as an ensemble. So I'm going to start actually with the bass drum, just because it's a little easier to look at. So I'm going to mute my woods, and we're just going to look at this low drum here. And you can see again, things are not on the lines whatsoever. Pretty far off, actually. But actually, I should say it's not terribly far off. So as we zoom in here, you can see that things are not quite lining up on the grid. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm inside my MIDI editor. So if you're not familiar with this, inside of Logic, you can get there. The way I do it is I click up on my recording, and it opens the MIDI editor right here. And we've looked at this a lot in previous videos. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but that's how I get to it. Now, there's different ways to quantize. What does this mean over here? This is our quantization slider. This is the basic one. We're just going to start with that one for today, and then in future videos, we'll get a little more advanced. But this is the basic one. So you can quantize to the nearest eighth note, the nearest 16th, the nearest 32nd, and so on, right? As well as going in the other direction. And all that's doing is it's saying, okay, well, where's the nearest eighth note? I'm going to move this note to the nearest eighth note. So an eighth note is actually a pretty good place to start with a piece like this. Let's just take a look. See how that sounds not so bad on its own? It's just when you start throwing the other instruments, they're not in beat. That's the problem. So we need it's more about getting everything in beat together. So what I actually do is I select my performance and I crank up my quantization, and watch, if you can't see there, hopefully you can see it's really moving everything now onto that grid. And just bear with me. I always do 100% at first. There we go. Another, this gets into some pretty subjective concepts pretty quickly, but one thing about drums, and particularly the low drums, there's an expectation that these are the timekeepers of the entire piece. They are almost expected to be perfect, right? We expect the drums to be hitting correctly. So there's an element of this where you don't want to over quantize, of course, because you don't want it to sound too mechanical. But there's also this interesting, sort of reality that the drums, and particularly the low drums, are kind of our timekeepers. And see how simple the bass drum is here? Boom, 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 boom. Very, very simple, just keeping the steady pace. So what I usually do, to be honest, is I crank my quantization up a lot at first, and I get it sounding good, because as I move down to my woods now, I want everything to be playing together. Then I go and I loosen up and I take it back. So let's take a look at our woods now. Same thing. Bear with me, but I'm going to crank this up on my eighth note quantization. Wow, see? That went overboard. It changed the rhythm of it. We also lost a lot of our flamming. If you're not familiar with flamming, flamming is when two hits aren't hitting exactly at the same time and you get a cool effect, kind of cool double sounding effect. Really effective to make things sound more realistic. I love my flams, and I usually end up going and putting them back in if my quantization takes them out. But let me just undo this one, because I think the eighth notes quantization that I just did was a little heavy. Let me go to the 16th notes. And again, I'm keeping it at 100 for now, 100 strength. That means it's 100% on the grid is what that means. And again, we probably won't end up with that because we want to loosen it up, but let's just at first. All right, so now we're talking. Now things are lined up. If I show you both my bass drum and my woods at the same time, you see the bass drum are the notes on the bottom here. Everything's lining up. Great. So again, I love to do this at first, and then we start going in and we start loosening up, and particularly for the woods, because again, I kind of like my bass drum to be a little bit more accurate and kind of keeping the pulse of the beat. But I'm going to drop it down a little bit. So remember, this was at eighth notes. So I'm going to lower the quantization on that. And you can kind of see that it's some are a little ahead, some are a little behind. That's okay. For now, I'll leave it at that. 80 is a nice middle ground, to be honest. Sometimes for a bass drum, it's between 80 and 90. I find that's just my taste, because it's pretty close to perfect, but not exactly perfect. And then for the woods, let's go back to our 16ths. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Okay, so now I'm going to lower this guy off as well. Now watch when I pull this one back. You're also getting some of the flamming back that I like. So see how these two are supposed to be hitting at the same time, but this one's just a little bit ahead. That's good. You want stuff like that. That's more impact, more natural, because when you're playing two drums at once, you never hit them at the same time. But again, they're not dramatically off so that it just sounds like it's completely wrong. Let's listen to this. I like that. So and so this, I quantized the woods even less. So they were quantized at about 70%. Another thing you can play with, of course, is swing. There's a whole, I cannot explain the official definition of swing. I'll put a link to like Wikipedia or some music resource in my description of this video. You could read more about it. Bottom line is swing, again, is adding that there's a whole style of swing music, but the bottom line is it's loosening up your performance even more and allowing the beat to kind of swing as opposed to be so rigid. This piece of music, I think, could not everything requires that. Not every kind of music you want to have swing. Sometimes you can use swing just subtly, just to introduce a little more variety and variance and humanity into the piece. Sometimes that works as well. I'm going to add a little bit in my woods because I think the woods can be a little loosened up. Let's just zoom in and see what that's actually doing. Sometimes it doesn't do much, to be honest. Yeah, so see, really what it's doing is it's just moving some of the notes a little bit further off the beat. What I don't like is it's getting rid of the flamming. So I don't like that. So I'm gonna keep it pretty low. This might even be not noticeable. But again, these are just tricks and techniques you can use. These are the most basic you can use within your MIDI editor, within your DAW. The quantization strength, and of course you're kind of playing around with how strong and how close to the grid you want to move the notes versus how kind of loose you want to make it. Again, up to you and the style of music. And then there's the swing, which gives you a little bit more color and allows you to move the notes a little bit further behind the beat and introduce some of that swing to the music. So it's not so like robotic, but it's got some swing to it. Swing is so hard to define. One last thing, and this will be for a future video, but I just want to show you really quick. You have all these other things you can play with. And this is where things get quite advanced and interesting. But the one, just really quickly, and we'll touch on this in a future video, but how do you add a little more randomness into the playing? After you've quantized everything like I've done, I've tightened it, it sounds good, I like it, I want to start playing around more. That's what the humanize feature is. Most MIDI editors will have it, and the humanizer is literally a way to add humanity back into the performance. How does it do that? It does it by literally randomizing certain aspects of the performance. And that's kind of the key point, it's random. So you don't have tremendous control over what it's actually doing, which can be good because humans are random when they play, but it can also do things that you don't like. So you just want to keep an eye on it. And I always recommend starting very conservatively. So you can randomize the position. Probably the most important thing to randomize within a percussion performance. The lower numbers, again, start with the lowest number you can get. Don't go too crazy at first. If you start playing around with this and you're moving things completely around your performance, it's not even going to sound the same anymore, right? It's going to be just random notes. So be conservative, start small, a nice low amount, and it's literally just going to randomize the positions of the notes you played. Pitch is not relevant in percussion, at least in this case, but you could randomize that. Velocity is an incredibly important one. We're going to talk about velocity in depth in the next video. That's going to be the focus of the next video is velocity, how to use velocity. And then length. And again, length is not terribly relevant for this type of percussion anyway, because these are just instant hits. They don't have a tail to them. They're not longer. They're not a tonal instrument, just in this case. But you might be using percussion instruments, or certainly with tonal instruments like strings. Absolutely, length is important. Anyway, this is an idea to kind of randomize it. You can select and operate and then see what it does, see how it sounds. So see, it's hard for me to tell you what it actually did because it's random, but I can see certain velocities now are much hotter than they were before. Like look at these ones, they pump this up. And it moved things around the screen. It actually doesn't sound bad. But again, I used a very conservative. These are very low numbers. If I'd crank this up, which I don't want to do because I don't want to mess with this right now, but if I'd crank these numbers up, those notes would be all over the screen. So be careful, but it's a great tool. And again, we're going to get into this in addition to velocity in the next videos on this series coming up. So hopefully this is helpful. I know this is kind of a short and quick, down and dirty, basic explanation of quantization within our digital audio workstations, whichever one you might be using. And it's ultimately a way to, improve the performance, bring everything tighter together, closer, more on the beat, more on the grid, bring the instruments together. But then, at least what I do is I bring them together, get everything nice, and then I go and I start loosening up and I start lowering the strength so they're not quite perfect. And I start playing with some of the other tools, such as swing, such as the humanize feature. And I do a lot of work with velocity and some of the other tools, and we're going to get into that in the next video. So if you like this, please like and subscribe. You don't want to miss the next videos in this series, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye.